Welcome all. I'm Don Garrett, Chair of the Philosophy Department here at NYU. Tonight's symposium is part of the year-long NYUAD lecture series, The Demands of Tolerance. We thank Hilary Ballin and Carrie Barrett and NYU Abu Dhabi for making this series and especially this evening's symposium possible. Tonight's symposium is the meaning of Locke's letter concerning toleration. Before I introduce our speakers, let me say a bit by way of introducing our topic, Locke's letter. This will be familiar to many of you. Written in Latin in 1685 while Locke was living in the Dutch Republic to which he had just fled. It's important to remember he was not just a political theorist, but a political actor. It was published anonymously in 1689 upon his return to England with the Glorious Revolution and soon followed by an English translation. In 1685 it was immediately provoked by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by Louis XIV, which had relieved French Protestants of the requirements of conformity to Catholicism. And more broadly, of course, the context is James II's battles with the Protestant Parliament over measures of toleration, the establishment of the Church of England, treatment of Protestant dissenters, and fear of a Catholic monarch. The anonymous work presents its author's opinion of mutual toleration among Christians. It draws a distinction between a commonwealth or civil society and a church, a voluntary association, and draws the boundary between them in terms of the kinds of goods at which they rightly aim. Its conclusion is that the whole jurisdiction of rulers is concerned solely with civil goods and should not and cannot be extended to the salvation of souls. It argues that the civil ruler has no mandate from God for the care of souls, that salvation depends on an inward conviction of the mind which cannot be produced by compulsion, that allowing civil rulers to prescribe a particular religion would give the great variety of incompatible religious beliefs held by rulers would give no guarantee that most people are prescribed the wrong religion, and adds that toleration is conducive to social order and peace and avoids conflict. And it distinguishes duties of toleration on the part of individuals, churches, clergy, and rulers, and of rulers with respect both to ritual and external worship, and belief and doctrine of both the theoretical and the practical kind. It is one of the greatest contributions to political theory in terms of its influence, not just at the time, but in England, but on Jefferson and the founders of the American Revolution, and it remains both famous and in its way influential to the present, but the question is how applicable is it now, or rather that's one of our questions. For the ambiguity of the title, the meaning of Locke's letter is intentional. We mean to ask both what did Locke mean to say in the letter, and what is the continuing significance of the letter. And our speakers tonight will address both of those questions. Our first speaker, not in the order in which you see it behind you, is John Dunn, Emeritus Professor of Political Theory at King's College, Cambridge. His first book in 1969 was The Political Thought of John Locke. That was the first of 20 books authored or edited, including Locke, A Very Short Introduction, and most recently, Setting the People Free, The Story of Democracy, published in 2005. His current research interests include the political thought of John Locke, the rethinking of modern political theory, the historical formation and intellectual weakness of liberal and socialist conceptions of political value, explaining political trajectories of varieties of modern states, and the historical development and current significance of democracy in different parts of the world. Our second speaker will be Ingrid Creppell, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University. She's the author of Toleration and Identity, Foundations of Early Modern Thought, published by Routledge in 2003, and co-editor of Toleration on Trial. Her research interests include early modern and modern political thought, theories of conflict and identity, origins of toleration and liberalism, and her current project concerns construction of the enemy idea as a conceptual, normative, and historical phenomenon, especially in American history. Though each of our speakers will speak for approximately 25 minutes, I will then provide a brief summary and a brief comment on each, and then we will turn it over to the audience for questions and discussion. We will aim to conclude around 8 o'clock as advertised. So without further ado, let me turn to John Dunn.
My title is The Demands of Tolerance, the general title of the series, and the Duty to Tolerate. Human beings hearten or menace one another in a bewildering variety of ways. All human beings find some aspects of their fellows offensive, revolting, or intimidating. Living with others on any scale at all has always been both a practical skill and an imaginative and emotional challenge. It has its rewards, but it unmistakably also has its costs. For individual actors, it's no doubt rational to maximize the rewards and minimize the costs, however hard it may be to measure either at all reliably. For human beings situated within and orientated towards ever larger groupings, it becomes far harder to see what approach towards responding to their situation is rational, even in bare outline, and increasingly hard to judge what's likely either to maximize our rewards or minimize our costs in doing so. How to share a house or even a room with anyone in particular can be tricky enough, but how could we ever tell how to share a world? Since the world we do now have to share is organized most emphatically in the last instance through what presents itself as a mutual exchange of good offices as an endlessly renegotiated price, it's become very hard to believe that there are any reliable recipes for maximizing rewards or minimizing costs within it. Hence the intellectual disarray of economics and the mitigated chaos of the world financial system and everything that depends on it, loosely speaking, all of us. Within that world, our world, the demands of tolerance sound one of the wearier elements in the cost structure, something intrinsically painful, which others assure us we must nerve ourselves to endure, but which it would be far more appealing to avoid if only we could get away with doing so. Considered carefully, tolerance is two quite distinct things: a concept and a psychic capability, an idea about how to relate to others, and the ability to live out and realize that idea in practice. The demands of tolerance are both the implications of the concept and the strains of submitting oneself to those implications. The concept itself is, I take it roughly, the disposition or virtue of graciously enduring our exposure to the numerous aspects of others which do disturb, distress, or alarm us. That discipline, never effortless, becomes especially irksome when what disturbs or distresses us is also something of which we deeply and reflectively disapprove. In those circumstances, it's no longer clear that tolerance can really be a virtue, since it readily and uncontrollably shades into complicity, and complicity in what we deeply disapprove must be much closer to a vice. Locke's Epistola de Tolerantia is one of the great totemic texts of the Western interpretation of the nature of that challenge and how to face it. Its original Latin title, when first published in Holland, strongly suggests that it's indeed devoted to interpreting tolerance. But William Poppl's English translation, which appeared very shortly afterwards, A Letter Concerning Toleration, gives a better sense of the question it does in fact address. A fair amount of it consists of praise of tolerance or abuse of intolerance on Christian and other grounds. But all of that praise or dispraise is predicated on a theoretical view of what human beings have a peremptory duty to tolerate, and of why there can be any such duty. Locke's judgments on what determines when a psychological disposition to tolerate is a virtue and when it's a vice issue directly from that theoretical view. The central judgment of the letter was that specifically religious toleration was a religious and a natural duty. The view itself didn't arise from and wasn't aimed at the world we now live in. It reacted to and reflected a radically different context. To see what its vision and arguments may still mean for us, we first have to grasp what it was in fact saying. and what prompted Locke to say it, and then think carefully about how the structure of reasons it articulates bears on our own predicaments in the very different contexts in which all of us now live. The imperative to tolerate the religious practices and beliefs of others was a belated and very hard-won European intellectual solution to a very hard puzzle. How should a Christian ruler use their power? Behind that question lurked the considerably harder question, as unsolved today as ever, of exactly what Christianity requires of those who've received its revelation. Locke's letter is certainly not a Christian devotional text, but it reflects more than a quarter of a century of very hard thinking about those questions, with the second and more perturbing looming considerably larger as time went by, and in the end, very largely taking over Locke's intellectual attention over the final years of his life. Toleration of the speculative opinions on religious matters, or the external worship favoured by others, was Locke's alternative to the orthodox view that Christian rulers had a peremptory and supervening religious duty to enforce their own assessments of Christianity's requirements on those who saw and felt those requirements very differently or didn't discernibly feel them at all. Both views interpreted the scope of authority and the responsibilities of power alongside the structures and content of Christian duty. Both agreed that it was the latter, the requirements of Christianity, which set the question to the former. To establish religious toleration as a political principle rather than a religious dereliction, it was first necessary to block the hallowed Augustinian judgment that forceful assertion of Christian truth to the obtuse and recalcitrant was a clear religious obligation. What subverted that judgment in Locke himself, and in the fullness of time has done so, even for all societies which still have Christian majorities, was the collapse in plausibility of the assumption that anyone, including those in political authority, had any secure means to distinguish Christian truth from personal misapprehension. Everyone, as Locke himself says at the very beginning of the letter, is orthodox in his own eyes. So Locke's letter marked the end of a very old dream. It carved an intellectual tombstone for the project of orthodox Christian political community. It didn't, of course, bring to an end the goal or ideal of Christian orthodoxy itself, since you can't be a Christian at all without presupposing that there's at least one way in which it's fully appropriate to try to live out Christianity's requirements. Even more conspicuously, it did little for some time to impede the repressive activities of rulers still trapped in the dream's thrall. The half-life of intellectual dreams can live on for many, many centuries, perhaps even millennia, wreaking intensely motivated devastation for as long as they continue to do so. Locke's was by no means the only powerful intellect in 17th century Europe to reach the conclusion that religious persecution is inherently confused and wrong. Spinoza, for instance, had clearly reached it before him, and Pierre Bayle at much the same time, and scattered individuals across Europe had definitely espoused it with varying degrees of clarity and on different premises over the two preceding centuries. But Spinoza plainly didn't reach it for Christian reasons, and it remains a subtle historical and psychological judgment how far, if at all, Bayle's reasons for reaching it really were Christian either in inspiration or rationale. The basis on which Locke secured his conclusive intellectual result was his conception of a church, not his conception of a political community. He did have a conception of a political community, and the letter duly invokes that conception, but it offers neither an extended articulation nor a robust defense of the conception. For those, you have to look elsewhere, to another work with a future ahead of it, unpublished at the time, but issued quite soon afterwards, the two treatises of government. That work didn't bring anything to an end, and certainly could not have terminated the dream of an orthodox Christian political community, an aspiration it scarcely even mentions. In the letter, Locke conceived a church as a free and voluntary society uniting for the public worshipping of God in a manner judged acceptable to him and effectual to the salvation of their souls. That's plainly a Christian conception of a church, a Christian term in the first place. Its key premise is that voluntariness is constitutive of Christianity. No one could arrive at the conclusion that voluntariness is constitutive of each and every religion by induction. So that conception is inherently unpersuasive to adherents of very many other religions. But Locke, I think, was right to recognize that it's hard to form a stable and coherent conception of Christianity's requirements which dispenses with voluntariness in the last instance. And anyway, no one has since offered such a conception with any real imaginative force, and unless and until they do so, that's why it's going to remain true, in my judgment, to see the letter as marking an intellectual tombstone, the end of a very long road. What it certainly doesn't do, alas, is show anyone how to judge the demands of tolerance, let alone how to set about learning how to meet them. Those demands we still have to judge for ourselves, and they become far harder to judge in the world we live in than they were in Locke's world. You can see why if you focus on just what Locke argued that human beings do have a religious and natural duty to tolerate. The key to his conception of the scope of what we must tolerate is set by a single criterion: what imperils our civil interests. No one whose religious intuitions give them reason to threaten our civil interests is entitled to toleration on the grounds that those intuitions are religious, whatever the imaginative or cognitive basis from which they presume to derive them. You can't be religiously entitled to menace other people's civil interests, still less their lives. You certainly can't be so if you belong to the same political community as they do. But in Locke's view, set out in the two treatises, you can't even be so if you're a transient denizen, however briefly, of that community and walking its streets. Even more evidently, you can't be so if you're a covert or open enemy of that community with an active will to harm it on a very large scale. In every great city in the world today, New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Madrid, Rome, Athens, Beijing, Moscow, Delhi, that's a very painful thought, and Locke can offer us no way of assuaging that pain. Because Locke's letter asserts the view of what both Christian and non-Christian rulers must tolerate, most of its secular readers today instinctively look to it for at least the outline of a theory of what human beings would still have a duty to tolerate independently of any religious convictions at all. So they focused principally on Locke's emphasis on the involuntariness of belief and the potential consequent futility of seeking to bludgeon them out of the beliefs they currently have into others of which you more approve. It would certainly be convenient to find such a theory, but the involuntariness of belief isn't going to do the trick. You can see why quite clearly if you look inside Locke's theory at one decisive criterion he offers for restricting toleration's scope, the distinction between theoretical and practical beliefs. What are entitled to toleration on religious grounds, in his eyes, are theoretical beliefs, more particularly in this context, beliefs about how to worship, whom to associate with on religious grounds and for religious purposes, and whom to treat as a religious authority. It's the religious character of those beliefs, the fact that their subject matter is explicitly religious, which gives them their protected status. But that protected status doesn't depend solely on the theory or vision on which they're supposedly founded. It also depends on whether or not they have practical consequences for anything but the practice of worship, the bounds of religious association, and the institutions or persons to whom they assign religious authority. If and when they do have practical consequences which spill over those boundaries, and if those consequences are deleterious to the civil interests of others, the mantle of religion can offer them neither license nor protection. The antithesis of theoretical beliefs in Locke's thinking is practical beliefs. Theoretical beliefs are beliefs about how to see and understand. This is all about his vocabulary and his way of thinking. It doesn't translate through to the shape of modern professional philosophy. Practical beliefs are beliefs about what to do. That distinction, as he saw it, is well suited to distinguishing what Locke himself needed to distinguish. You don't need to think for very long to recognize how singularly ill-suited it is for distinguishing what we need to distinguish and are going to go on having to try to distinguish. A theoretical belief about how to worship or whom to associate with for that purpose sounds anodyne enough to a modern secular ear. But how about a theoretical belief about whom to try to kill, for what purposes, on what grounds, and within what restrictions? That's a topic on which professional philosophers in a country like this have often recently chosen to devote extended attention, and surely very appropriately. It's also one about which Pentagon officials, intelligence operatives, political authorities, police officers, and cadres of the armed services think with varying urgency almost all the time. You can view the philosopher's beliefs quite plausibly as theoretically not merely in aspiration, but also in substance. But the bearing of the beliefs of their state counterparts is unmistakably all too practical. It falls, and falls quite heavily, for better and for worse, on the civil interests of quite a large proportion of the world's population. Their beliefs are no more and no less voluntary than the beliefs of professional philosophers, though they are likely to be formed and modified under more drastic pressures. What matters about the difference between those two bodies of reflection and the assertions in which they issue from Locke's point of view isn't the contrast in the aspirations of the agents concerned. It's their relative consequentiality. It's quite reasonable for anyone but philosophers. I hope this doesn't sound rude, but I'm trying to make a point in particular. It's quite reasonable for anyone but philosophers to see much contemporary philosophy as wholly inconsequential, devoid of external consequences to which it must answer. But it is insulting to philosophers to assume that it's bound to prove so. In Locke's way of thinking, of seeing the matter, a theoretical belief isn't merely one which has yet to affect what anyone has so far happened to do. It's one which can't affect what anyone does, a belief irretrievably confined to the realm of reflection. On questions about whom to kill, and when, and why, and how, it's a very feeble belief indeed, however intricately theorized, which is pre-condemned to inconsequentiality. The point in his own text where those issues come into sharpest focus is the place where he repudiates the idea that there's a duty to tolerate two categories of beliefs, which are certainly theoretical in aspiration, but which he judged to be eminently practical in prospective consequence. Both embarrass contemporary secular readers of Locke, but one is more unnerving than the other. The first covers those who believe themselves to have religious license to threaten political authorities which don't share their religious convictions. In Locke's case, the category immediately in question was Roman Catholics, co-religionists of James II, led into exile by the time the letter appeared in print, and of Louis XIV, still very much on the throne of France, and fresh from hounding his hapless Huguenot subjects with the Royal Dragoons. Locke's argument in the letter and elsewhere wasn't that Catholics should be excluded from toleration because they worshipped inappropriately, submitted themselves to an inherently disreputable set of religious authorities, or held intellectually grotesque beliefs on religious matters. It's far from clear that he did believe that Catholics as such should be excluded from toleration at all. What he insisted was that any Catholics who accepted the thesis that their confessional allegiance freed them from allegiance to the English state in its current hands were a direct menace to the civil interests of most of their fellow countrymen or countrywomen, a wholly reasonable inference, if not certainly a valid one, from the English political experience of the preceding decade. It's instructive that Locke should have chosen to develop that train of thought in the letter by considering the corresponding obligations of a Muslim who happens to be living in a Christian country. That's a bit of the letter it's worth looking at very carefully today. What remains disconcerting to any secular reader is his emphatic refusal of toleration to anyone who denies the existence of any God. Here, at least, it's reasonable to see him as parting company with Spinoza and with Bayle's explicit judgment on the same question. His grounds for doing so were what he took to be atheism's practical implications, that the belief that there is no God can't be purely theoretical because it destroys the binding power of promises or oaths, the only basis on which human beings can, in principle, hope to live in trust with one another. As he put it, the taking away of God, though but even in thought, dissolves all. Now, few people today, Christian or otherwise, are still inclined to applaud that assessment. And the only type of atheist who could consistently accept it would have to be one who never intended to bind themselves by anything they said, and even then would scarcely welcome its being reflected in state policy towards them. Locke's views on the practical hazard which atheism presented weren't carefully thought out at the time, and shouldn't commend themselves, in my view anyway, to anyone more than 3 centuries later. But they did arise from very careful thinking about the reasons human beings have for choosing to do anything. And if Locke's own reflections failed to uncover a clear and convincing conception of the shape and character of those reasons in their entirety, it isn't as though our own Byzantine elaboration of judgment on the same topic has since yielded anything that might possibly do instead. We must each judge the demands of tolerance as best we can for ourselves, as our human forebears have always had to, and our successors are plainly still going to go on needing to for as long as we can readily imagine. Locke himself wasn't an especially tolerant man, irritable, suspicious, and often less than compulsively generous. But that was a personal limitation of which we all have plenty. It wasn't a theoretical commitment. A letter concerning toleration expresses one of his most strenuously considered theoretical commitments. If we see it through the prism of history, it can still help us to judge those demands intelligently for ourselves, though we must either find the resources to meet them inside ourselves already, or look for them elsewhere.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an enormous pleasure to be on this panel with Professor Dunn, whose work I studied beautiful prose, every word up, when I was first working on this issue. Toleration turns out to be a very complicated idea. In one form, it appears quite simple and obvious: allow people to believe and act as they want, so long as they do no harm. But for this allowance to be a value or a principle, it assumes that one's initial inclination is to reject or suppress what those people believe, how they act, or what they are. Otherwise, one is not exercising tolerance, but rather agreeing with them or merely indifferent. So this well-known paradox in the analysis of toleration is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to delving into the ambiguities of the idea. One problem may be that we have tried to apply the idea to treating difference and conflict in contemporary contexts for which its original religious usage does not quite fit. Nevertheless, this elusive virtue, as it's been called, continues to serve as a major reference point in debates about how to manage relationships in the world today, and I think that's significant. So the argument that some philosophers and political theorists make that tolerance is irrelevant to today's conflicts, I think, misjudges the fact that people still are inclined and desire to use this idea. So why is that the case? Maybe a look back at its origins can help us think more clearly about whether we should be employing this term, what it might require, and how to bring it about. So I've been asked to talk about Locke's letter concerning toleration. As has already been stressed, this text remains the most famous document to first argue forcefully for religious toleration, and it's been a profound defining influence on major concepts and principles in the tradition of liberal political thought. Thomas Jefferson considered Locke one of his intellectual heroes, and he borrowed freely from Locke's work to craft the writing of the Declaration of Independence and his own arguments for religious freedom in the United States. The idea of the separation of church and state, for instance, is most clearly developed as a tool for political thinking by Locke in the letter. Because it's so important and foundational, and because it remains a rich and multifaceted piece of writing, it's been interrogated from many angles over the centuries. I also find it quite significant that in the past 15 years, nearly 7 times as many articles were published on Locke and toleration as appeared in the previous 15 years. So it's interesting to think, why are people going back to that in this last decade and a half? The issues we confront today are not the same as Locke's in the time he set out to convince his readers that toleration ought to be a core political principle. We already uphold the idea and argue about its meaning, implementation, and limits. But aspects of modern conflicts have led to the retrieval of Locke and to the resurgence of the language of toleration, and it's instructive to examine what he continues to offer. Locke's earliest writings and his very last treated the question of toleration. Remarkably, given his famous defense, Locke's first position in 1660 was an argument against toleration, asserting that the ruler's authority extended to control all aspects of religious worship. 25 years later, Locke would set out in impassioned prose why this view was exactly wrong. There are many hypotheses about what led to his radical turnaround, but we might take it as indicative of an ideological change that became available for others as well over the course of many decades in the early modern period, so that the notion of allowing diverse religious practices and groups to coexist within one country went from seeming like a dangerous idea and an impossible experiment to being a necessary idea and political goal. Locke's text, then, can be taken as a key element in that transformation. So while Professor Dunn has cast Locke's letter as the end of a very long road and a solution to a very thorny intellectual and political philosophical question about the nature of a Christian ruler's power, I see Locke's letter as marking the beginning of a modern discussion over learning how to meet the demands of tolerance. That is, how do we live in a world that is full of friction in a diverse political body. I want to show that Locke develops 2 main approaches to toleration. These are toleration as separation and toleration as ethos. I sketch out what each of these mean, and then I attempt to show how they're related. And then I'll try to make some comments about contemporary conflicts and how his work might be applied there. Before examining his 2 conceptions, I want to say something about aspects of the situation that he confronted in writing this work. Who is Locke's audience? What wall of opinion was he up against? In most people's view at that time, toleration signified a failure of giving up on the ideal of a community on earth committed to living according to God's commands. After the publication of his letter, the chaplain of All Souls College at Oxford, Jonas Prost, attacked Locke's position and then engaged in an extended debate that led to hundreds of additional pages about the issue of toleration, which ended only when Locke died in 1704 with his unfinished 4th letter concerning toleration. So clearly, great opposition remained to the notion of allowing diverse religious groups to believe and worship as they wished. Locke actually wrote the letter while he was in exile in Holland at the time when the French demonstrated the tenuous nature of steps toward tolerance by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, a policy which had granted Huguenots protection from persecution since 1598. So while some political leaders over the decades had attempted, either tacitly or through prominent edicts, to grant some measure of tolerance to minority groups, toleration remained disconnected from a full theory of political power and political ethics. The audience to whom Locke addressed his work included all members of the fragmented political body, feuding religious groups, church leaders, and political rulers. And I think this is important to keep in mind. Locke was not just targeting his defense to the interests or logic of one segment of the population, that is, the rulers who persecute. So how does he make the case for a conflict-ridden set of people and leaders that the idea of toleration is both necessary and good? Okay, so let me turn to this idea of toleration and separation. The most famous soundbite to come out of the letter is the separation of church and state, or politics and religion. Locke insisted that we must accept a sharp division of the human world into two distinct domains of power, of value, of modes of action, and experience. The jumbling of the boundaries between heaven and earth had led to endless controversies besetting civil societies. The confusion of overlapping jurisdictions would cease then if we mark the difference between political power applied to distinctly civil goods and interests and the power of the church or clergy within religious associations that are entered freely and voluntarily for sharing spiritual beliefs and public worship. Now, this assertion of a distinction, this redescribing of the world, is not itself an argument. It's a redescription of the world, and it would take a lot of work for people to come to accept this redescription of how the world was divided. Toleration, premised on the separation between church and state, demands that religious believers be allowed to practice as they choose without interference or repression. This principle is directed at the behavior of political rulers. These rulers, as well as those who expect a certain type of action from them, ought to rethink the role of the political ruler. Locke elaborates four main arguments to disconnect political power from religious salvation, and Donne has already mentioned these. First, God never granted authority to rulers to control belief and worship. There's no mandate from God to this effect. Secondly, rulers are incapable of bringing about true saving belief in their subjects, and therefore it's irrational for them to attempt to do so. This is Waldron's main focus in a famous article that he wrote. They cannot do this because their tools are those of outward force, and physical force is ineffectual in making the soul choose God, a process that depends upon the individual's conscience, a free will offering in which the person accepts the light of truth. Now, this would be kind of the bone of contention, or one of the major ones in his controversy with Proust. Third, even if they could, the fact that all rulers all over the world uphold different religions would mean that a person's chances of achieving salvation would be arbitrary or random, depending upon the luck of where they happen to be born. A principle of political coercion in support of religious truth, then, would condemn most people in the world to what will turn out to be some incorrect dictate and would certainly not achieve their salvation. And Locke believed in a capacity for individuals to find salvation, or to find their way to God through some acceptance of truth. Finally, political and social order would be preserved if a ruler allowed his subjects to choose their own religious belief and worship, because being free to practice religion as they desired would give potentially hostile groups no grounds for anger or grievance. The points that I want to make about Locke's arguments for the limitations on political power then are the following. The restriction of the ruler's domain is a form of institutional toleration. The principle prohibits rulers and the clergy, who would use politics for their own sectarian purposes, from infringing on the rights of individuals and groups pursuing religious freedom. Institutional toleration exists through acceptance of limitations on the proper reach of laws and on how physical force is justifiably deployed. I would argue, however, that the theory of toleration and separation should not be seen merely as a practical limitation of political power. In decoupling politics from religion, it establishes political power as a distinct and unique authority, no longer beholden to a non-political source of justification. The theory backing up a conception of political power as autonomous and ethically valuable in its own right is spelled out in the second treatise. But I think that we should see toleration here as part and parcel of that broader theory of political autonomy. So the realm of politics is not just restricted by law, it is given an autonomous justification with its own ethical foundations. Furthermore, toleration and separation signals to members of the political body that the institutions of political power are not up for capture by a particular religious faction. Their public status as officially unbiased enables rulers of political authority to serve as a symbolic focal point for collective adjudication and identification rather than simply division. Now, typically, Locke's restriction of civil power is taken as the primary orientation of his argument for toleration. And I want to show that the letter contains a very different conception, which I think perhaps could be useful in applying it to our own issues. And that's the toleration as ethos. Locke simultaneously presents the case for toleration in the form of a political ethos. And what I mean by this is the ideas, habits, and expectations people should have to support a society which is consciously acknowledged to allow difference and yet remains a common enterprise. Those two things have to go together. Persons in tolerant political societies do not simply keep to themselves in a private sphere with fences between groups managed by a neutral political authority. Rather, they demonstrate capacities to engage in altercations, explicitly accept the fact of continued difference, and uphold their civil society as a unified political body. This can be put another way. Political society is an emergent entity, and it requires that members sustain it directly as this specific type of tolerant collective entity. Being able to do this requires an ethos of toleration. My suggestion that Locke requires a general ethos of toleration, I think, can be extracted from the following features of the text. First, the terminology of the letter discusses at length the mutual toleration of individuals toward one another, of churches and clergymen toward one another, and most importantly, of rulers toward individuals and churches under their official authority. Now, one might want to stress that these duties are negative duties, to refrain from infringement, but that's not how Locke describes the nature of the attitudes and actions required. He writes, for instance, that a clergyman in his role as a teacher ought to, quote, take up the task of advising his people on their duties of peace and goodwill towards all men, toward those who are in error, as well as the orthodox, toward those who share their beliefs, as well as those who differ. Secondly, we can find in the opening lines and throughout the piece his emphasis that true Christianity is a religion of peace and love, and he quotes from the Bible to show that toleration upholds the essential Christian message. So Christianity then serves as another resource here. Next, he scathingly denounces those who use religion in a righteous way and then go on to show their hypocrisy, corruption, and cruelty. I think one passage in particular powerfully describes the treatment of American Indians by Christians once Christians gained the upper hand, and he writes, quote, in the course of time, Christians became the stronger party. It is only then that it becomes a duty to trample upon agreements and violate rights to get rid of idolatry. From then on, innocent pagans, scrupulous observers of justice in that they have not offended against good morals in the civil law, are to be stripped of their lives, property, and ancestral lands if they will not abandon their ancient worship and transfer their allegiance to new and foreign rites. So here he explicitly notes the natural and commendable tolerance shown by natives to the Europeans and contrasts this to the dogmatic justification for intolerance once settlers had power. In addition to this evidence, other passages strongly underscore my interpretation that Locke argues for much more than institutional separation. One of them is the more famous lines from the letter, which John has already mentioned. And he repeats this on 3 different occasions. Everyone is orthodox in their own eyes, which is in the very first paragraph of the letter. Every church is orthodox in its own eyes, and every prince regards his own religion as orthodox. So this idea of orthodoxy and the hardness of orthodoxy is not washed out in the text. The hardness of the boundaries of difference and intransigence of diverse faiths is recognized, but not taken as an obstacle to toleration. Locke does not argue that people will stop believing themselves to hold the right point of view, and yet he also clearly intends to demonstrate that nevertheless, there's a way to live together despite separate orthodoxies. Even more directly, he points out the necessity of a vigorous public display of one's difference. Quote, everyone knows and agrees that God should be publicly worshipped. Why else are we compelled to attend public services? That is why people living in this freedom must join an ecclesiastical association, so that they may attend services not only for their mutual spiritual development, but also to give public witness that they are worshipers of God and offer the divine Godhead a form of worship of which they are not ashamed and do not believe to be unworthy or displeasing to him. They also seek to attract others to a love of religion and truth by the purity of their doctrine, by the holiness of their lives, and by the decent grace of their ritual, and to provide for these other things that cannot be done by individuals privately. When we add together his repetition of everyone is orthodox to himself, and the passage on the value and the drive toward public expression, I think we end up with a very strong argument for toleration as political ethos, the capacity of citizens in such societies to interact with one another in a public sphere characterized by great and often difficult diversity. Toleration as separation and as ethos are interdependent. The logic of their interdependence might be described as follows. A political power makes the move to implement the separation demand. The action of refraining from pushing religious uniformity establishes its institutional neutrality and gains for it consent of people who will be different in their individual and group commitments. But they do not shrink into a private sphere, fenced off from interaction, and the tensions and the frictions of interaction will continue. In order for the public expression of difference to be exercised without it leading to a detraction from the base of unity which formed the political society, people will have to exercise an ethos of toleration, a capacity to do 3 things. Find a level of commonality across the alienness that exists between and among people. Second, acknowledge, and there's a big literature today on whether that acknowledgement needs to be in the form of full-scale recognition or respect of difference, but some form of seeing and acknowledging the other. And thirdly, to sustain a flexibility at the margins of judgment and self-protection in order to absorb and move within a diverse, politically conflictual environment without destruction of the self. And by that I mean that these kinds of societies are going to pose risks for individuals who live in them. Those risks can't be totally solved. And yet, there has to be a way in which those risks are accepted, but they're not too extreme. There's the argument that toleration only exists when nothing is really at stake. And I don't think that that is accurate. Nevertheless, it cannot be the case that your entire world is about to fall apart. So how do you create the possibility of a kind of risk that exists in society in the interaction across diversity and yet also maintain a unity in that? So how does this interpretation of Locke's letter provide a way to think about issues of toleration today? One of the reasons that I think the language of toleration has been resuscitated is because it seems perhaps religion is at the root of a lot of what has divided people, these global conflicts and conflicts within societies. But I think that this may not be the only or even the main reason that an appeal to tolerance is now more prominent. Certain types of conflicts engender a language and capacity for tolerance. We didn't say when we were at odds or when the Soviet Union was our enemy, we didn't talk about tolerating the Soviet Union. But we did talk about the expectation that the American political system might be one that would be expected to tolerate the existence of a Communist Party. This is because the presence of the threatening other was next door within one's own community or society, and it requires fundamental distinctions as well as some level of community to be sustained at the same time. I think today the proximity of many groups who are different has become more salient because of changes in global connections, movement and migration, and communication. So people experience the proximity of difference more acutely, and the uncertainty and the risks of trying to judge the expectations of these different groups within one's societies is more prominent as an issue. So the interdependence of the world, immigration, movement, and the communication. Now, I just want to mention some of the headlines of the past few months. Last summer, we had communities organizing and marching against the building of mosques in suburbia. So here's one realm in which we see this problem. There's an enormous fracas over the plans to build the Cordoba House near Ground Zero, and Michael Bloomberg gives a major address called Defending Religious Tolerance, Remarks on the Mosque near Ground Zero. Today, we can see in France, the ban on the burqa went into effect. In Spain, Switzerland, France, and Germany, this question of banning burqa in public became a major issue. We have scapegoating of immigrants, which has increased as a reliable means of fear-mongering among American voters. Even in the wake of the Gabby Giffords shooting, there's a public debate centered on the kind of acrimonious, intolerant nature of political speech. And very recently, in a widely noticed address at the Conference on Security Policy in Munich, British Prime Minister David Cameron criticized state multiculturalism for promoting extremism. And he remarked that, quote, hands-off tolerance allowed the growth of a separate sense of identity from the core values of Little Britain, and went on, quote, frankly, we need a lot less of the passive tolerance of recent years and much more active, muscular liberalism. It would be interesting to consider whether the presentation of the choice in that way itself is conducive to tolerance or not. So looking across these examples, I propose that a certain structure of contemporary conflicts makes toleration relevant in these cases. And it's similar structure to the type of conflict that Locke was dealing with. First, and I've mentioned some of this, the first one is the fact of difference, alienness, the belief, your disagreement with the other, your belief that the other is wrong, fundamentally wrong about the way that they are choosing to live their life. For instance, the issue of gay marriage, fundamentalists believe that that is deeply wrong. Secondly, proximity, that the interaction is quite demanding, and that the pressures put upon individuals and groups in societies requires this juggling and the fact that you are next door to each other. And finally, the sense of risk itself and to the nature of social cultural identity that comes out of that interaction. Tolerance emerges as a possible solution to these conflicts then through the development of a sense at some level of commonality, some basis, and I think that we got that from certain language that Locke used in his understanding of how others should be treated. What kind of acknowledgement is there? His expectation that your performance of your religious beliefs in public would be something that had to be acceptable, and that a society, a public, could accept that and live with it, was a form of acknowledgement and public display. And finally, a sense of flexibility. How is it that persons will be able to come to live in these kinds of environments? Who can you trust? And what basis will there be for that kind of risk-taking? Now, I want to say that behind all of these capacities, I think, is a requirement that's implicit in Locke's theory that we need to see as operating to sustain tolerant interaction, and perhaps it's helpful in determining what the limits of toleration are, and it's this. that people demonstrate a commitment to the common project of the collective civil life within which tolerance needs to be practiced. Belief in the legitimacy and value of the unified political society and institution serves as a background belief. If there is no will to a common political unity, it's hard to see how the centrifugal forces of conflict can be held in check by just a simple desire for tolerance, a desire to be nice to the person next to you in some kind of individual or personal way. So beliefs and practices that show a will to destroy the bases of the political body will be hard to tolerate. The big question, it seems to me, is always this: when will people interpret another's orthodoxy to, in effect, destroy their own will to continue to live on a common basis? So I think that is the big question that is raised by this, but I believe that Locke does give us some resources for thinking about the kinds of conflicts that we have facing us today, and I think it's located and it comes out of his understanding that there is something profoundly ethical about political interaction, political life, your commitment to a common society, a common civil world, political body, and that understanding and being able to trust the other to share that commitment to a common life can go some way towards reducing the inevitable risk that comes with living in diversity.
So John Dunn helpfully distinguishes tolerance understood as two different things. One is the concept of a dispositional virtue to endure exposure to what disturbs us, and even that of which we deeply disapprove. That's the concept of a dispositional virtue when it's a virtue, but as he notes, that can also be complicity in something that we disapprove, and that can seem to be a vice. And so the concept of the dispositional virtue is one thing. Another is the psychological capacity to act on that conception. Professor Dunn reminds us that Locke thought hard about the duty to toleration, but argues that his solution is limited in several ways. First, to subvert the alternative of a duty to impose true religion by force required, at least for Locke, a collapse in plausibility of the assumption that anyone had a secure means to distinguish Christian truth from misapprehension. So it raises the question of whether a commitment to tolerance in this kind of case can really work without at least some moderate skepticism or modesty, intellectual modesty, about ourselves. Secondly, it requires treating religion, Locke's solution requires treating religion as a voluntary association, so that the voluntary character of valuable assent is foremost. But as Professor Dunn notes, it's not necessarily the case that all religions will have this view. Third, Professor Dunn argues that Locke cannot show us how to judge the proper limits of toleration more generally outside the religious context, and that we see this in the lines that he attempts to draw, allowing religious practice and theoretical beliefs as subject to toleration, while Locke does not tolerate civilly harmful practical beliefs, which in his case was the Catholic, supposed Catholic belief in an external authority over the state, and atheism, and for which, for us, may include beliefs about whom to kill. His conclusion then is that we may admire Locke for thinking hard about this and emulate Locke's effort, but we must find out for ourselves the limits of toleration, that is, the line between the vice and the virtue, and the psychological resources to be tolerant. It would be ironic then if, having conceded that a commitment to tolerance requires at least some moderate degree of skepticism about our ability to determine the truth about the topics under dispute, we then find ourselves driven to moderate skepticism about our ability to find the proper line between tolerance as a virtue and the vice of accepting and tolerating too much. Professor Creppell draws another helpful distinction between toleration as separation and toleration as ethos. Toleration as separation is the separation of the civil and the religious and limits the proper scope of political power, but equally separates political power from the need for justification by religion. The political power has its own proper authority, which reminds us that it's not subject to capture by religious groups. Toleration as ethos is much like Professor Dunn's concept of tolerance as a virtue. Individuals accept and allow difference, but, as Professor Creppell emphasizes, while cooperating politically and to enable their political cooperation. She provides considerable evidence of this ethos in Locke and describes it as having three requirements: finding a level of commonality across alienness, acknowledging and even respecting difference, and sustaining flexibility at the margins of judgment and self-protection. Locke's lessons, she finds, involve a citizenship based on an identity that's not reducible to religion, so that we need not just rights and separation of church and state, but a capacity to interact in a public sphere with those who differ. That the burden of justification is on those who would restrict toleration, while we must consider the bearing of what is restricted on the participation of others, and that the political authority ought not to become a party to some group. This may not be a complete criterion of what to tolerate, but in her view, Locke offers us a distinct vantage point as members of a cooperative political body from which to cooperate. I wonder only whether we can achieve a sufficient level of commonality, sufficient respect for difference, and sufficient flexibility at the margins of difference without at least some modest skepticism about ourselves or reflections that will lead us in that direction. Our speakers will now not only tolerate, but appreciate comments and questions. So the floor is open. Yeah, sure, I will call on people. Yeah, sorry.
In John Dunn's presentation, he emphasized the grounds for not tolerating Catholics or not tolerating atheists had to do with the practical consequences, which he understood to be the features of those practices. So that suggests that the limits of toleration are determined, at least in part, by what claims to be tolerated, what views are to be tolerated, what the consequences are. Now, Locke could have been right or wrong, but either one. If he was probably wrong about atheists, he might have been right at that time about Catholicism. I don't know, but in any case, it seems like moving to today, that do you think it's actually the right way to think about what should be tolerated and what shouldn't? To determine what the practical consequences of those beliefs are or would be? Is that the right methodology for trying to understand what ought to be tolerated or not?
Well, no, I don't think it is very helpful. I mean, that's part of the central argument I wanted to develop. I mean, I think that in the particular context of disagreement about what the duties of a Christian ruler were, it was a very serviceable distinction to think about beliefs which might stay within the impact of which on practice might be confined to specifically religious subject matter. But in the general difficulty of interaction between human beings, that is not actually a very large part of the trouble space. I mean, what is practically problematic in human interaction. And I think even in a setting where, for fairly definite reasons, people have a strong focus on the idea of a particular interpretation of religion, of a particular religion as being a source of intense peril, the thought that you shouldn't be intolerant about religion as such is not going to clarify anything at all about the nature of the practical problem. And I don't think that I don't myself believe that the entire idea of respecting others' beliefs is a sort of a safe guide to anything that we need to do in this space, because I think that to respect someone's beliefs, you have to think of them as being credible. I mean, not sort of unbizarrely credible. And I think a great many of other people's beliefs, and very probably quite a lot of my own beliefs, I mean, are poor candidates for things which are other than bizarrely credible. I mean, we incur our beliefs in a bewildering variety of ways, and a lot of them are rubbish. So I don't think one should start off from thinking about how to cope with living with other people on the basis of what proportion of what they believe can I take seriously. I think that the idea of respecting them has some sort of, in a sense, almost animal plausibility to it. But the idea of respecting the content of their beliefs seems to me calamitous. I think you don't want to consider the problem in those terms at all.
That wasn't a question, it was about the practices. I was drawing on your distinction about practices. So it's not at all about the content of beliefs, it's about the practices.
Yes, I think...
How do they determine the limits of belief? Is it to be centered on practices? Nothing about content.
Well, insofar as the beliefs, I mean, are strongly determining of the content of practices, then it probably does help. I mean, to take the example that, I mean, all of us must have fairly close to the middle of our screens, the question of whether or not the interpretations of the duties of a Muslim are to try to kill on a large scale enemies of Islam. I mean, that is you could certainly say that if you have a sort of vivid and shapely conception of that as being your duty, and it comes from your interpretation of the requirements of Islam, that will probably have a fairly definite context in some ways. I mean, it arises from a particular tradition of theological interpretation and so on. But it's actually distressingly free-floating, so I don't think that, I mean, you can incur that structure on the basis of, you know, the most, I mean, being in prison next to someone. It isn't going to be very helpful. And I think if you think of these questions, as it were, loosely speaking, from the point of view of the professionals of security within a particular population, those whose continuing responsibility is to try and think out what should be done, how people's liberties should be constrained in order for the safety of the majority or the vast majority to be better protected. Obviously, it will be a helpful clue to whom to watch closely, who have shown themselves to hold vividly this particular interpretation of what Islam requires. So you could, I mean, some forms of menace can be tracked helpfully through the shape of belief, but I mean, you can't say anything very helpful about what liberties shouldn't be infringed through the category of belief at all, unless the belief has already got very close indeed to action. And that's why I think, I mean, what are the contours of a practice? I mean, that is a very difficult judgment to make, and I don't think it's not the sort of judgment which is made better by being bureaucratized. So this is a very deep problem, and it's going to stay a very deep problem.
Do you want to add something?
Well, I
Go ahead.
I like that you emphasize that we think there's a distinction between tolerating persons or respecting persons versus tolerating their beliefs, and that I think that's a helpful distinction to make, because that gives a sounder foundation for arguing that in general we allow and respect and tolerate other persons as being agents who may have their own ideas, but until they prove that those are practically dangerous, the inclination is to grant that. And so it seems to me that that distinction then opens up a much broader defense of toleration.
I certainly think it's a more promising approach to starting off with how seriously can you take their beliefs.
Ingrid, can you just say a little bit more about the relationship between the two different conceptions of religious tolerance that you talked about? So I kind of thought that in the letter that the arguments that you referred to as the arguments for separation established that we ought to take on this ethos of religious tolerance. So I sort of thought that the separation arguments, those are sort of the arguments for why we ought to be tolerant. So then the ethos stuff is sort of the conclusion of the other arguments, but you want to say something different, that they're separate.
I think they're based on different capacities. I mean, one is, and they're targeted at different actors and ways of reasoning. So the separation argument is that the ruler must refrain from trying to control all of these areas of human life. They are connected insofar as when the ruler does that, he or she is acting in such a way that they can generate a sensation of trust, perhaps, in the population, because these warring groups then say, okay, we don't have to keep fighting over trying to control the ruler, because the ruler's not going to be able to do whatever I want him to do. But it's targeted at the ruler's jurisdiction, right? Then you have to say something about, okay, what kind of human beings live in a society in which you have those separate jurisdictions? Is it people who just kind of shrink back into their little private worlds and live in these separate spheres and don't come out and interact in the broad light of day? So I think that those are two different ways of thinking about what's required to live in a tolerant society, and they're two different kinds of societies.
I have a question about the relationship between the principle of religious toleration and the establishment of religion. Of course, in this country, when we think about religious toleration, we think and speak of the separation of church and state. We immediately think of the disestablishment of religion and regard that as a necessary requirement or entailment of any really serious and robust constitutionalized program of religious toleration. And although Locke certainly doesn't make this argument himself, many defenders of disestablishment defend it on roughly Lockean grounds by saying something like this: if you allow for the establishment of religion, that will, of any religion, that will become inevitably a source of friction and tension, of envy and disappointment within the political community that will frustrate or endanger the achievement of civic goals of one kind or another. And so that's why you shouldn't allow it if you're going to really be serious about separating church and state in the way that Locke proposes. But of course, that isn't a conclusion that everyone in the world has come to. There are plenty of examples of, broadly, I think we can all agree, are religiously tolerant polities that have established religions. And one of the contemporary issues that is a source of particular tension and conflict is this: whether you can have an adequate principle or program of religious toleration and an established religion too, which you've either inherited or the majority of people want, or for whatever reason. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on
that. My response to that would be there will be different traditions of having to make these kinds of decisions about whether toleration requires an absolute ban on the establishment of religion in the public sphere. And so the resources for generating capacities for civic tolerance may not require, say, a complete ban on the establishment. See, Norway, Israel, many places do not have that, and yet there's an expectation that treatment of other religious groups, minority groups, will be based on ideas of religious freedom. So whether it's absolutely necessary, I think that I would not make the argument that for toleration to actually exist in that society, that they would have to get rid of this tradition in which there has been a national church. That seems implausible because somehow that national church has just become part of the furniture of that society's way of dealing with it. So, I wouldn't go in that direction. But I do think that in different traditions and histories, those questions have been struggled over, and different compromises have been made, and different resources have been constructed to try to deal with a diversity of religious groups. So.
I suppose, I mean, there are things you can say about Locke himself, and then there are things you can say about what's happened since in a lot of different places. I mean, Locke himself was an observant member of the Church of England, pretty heterodox one by the then standards of the Church of England, but certainly was that. And of course, he didn't think of himself as being heterodox, because he thought he had better judgment than most of his fellows, so he thought he was closer to what it would be to be orthodox. This is seriously, that doesn't matter. But what does matter, I think, definitely, is that he was struggling in a political context to diminish the level of practical intolerance of the established church, and it was not a practical political program to disestablish that church. He probably didn't want to. So, I mean, what he did think was it was really urgent to stop that church being a persecuting church. He had a little success in doing that. As much as he liked doing it, it wasn't bad for the time. But I think that whether you can have, as it were, a good approximation, a good instantiation of religious toleration in a society with an established church depends very much on how seriously you take the established church. If you take the established church in the way that the British population, the English population, I think the British population nowadays take it, I mean, with a very substantial helping of salt, then you certainly can. It isn't a practical matter anymore. The Church of England is an established church. It was within my lifetime. This is a recent development. I mean, level of salinity has gone up considerably. But I think it's right that I mean, the impulse to coerce, the impulse to sort of load the dice is very, very strong in a church, which is a power-structured political institution, among other things. So, I mean, it's a promising contribution to religious toleration in an established church. And it's only sort of no cost at all, if in fact it's sort of only barely there as a directive force in anyone's life. It's confined rigorously to private life.
I learned a great deal this evening, and thank you very much for your description of the letter, of which I have the most cursory grasp. And this question will be, I think, quite ignorant. But it seems that most of the conversation, when we've been speaking of diversity of religious opinion, we've been viewing it, as Locke's age did, as a problem. It's deeply threatening for them. It gets lots of people killed. It's the wake of the wars of religion. I'm wondering, though, is there anything in Locke where the diversity of religious opinion is seen instead in a different way, so long as you're not dealing with violence, actually a good thing? In other spheres, in a philosophy department, a diversity of opinion is what makes the department interesting. No one would want to be in a department where everybody was of the same school. I suspect that, among the scholastics, even when it came to religion, as long as you're not advancing heresy, all the better to have a disputation. And it seems to me that, in intellectual history, there are a lot of folks like that. If I could, I hope I don't bend your ear. Even Augustine, the villain of the evening, I remember he says in the Confessions, when he talks about the Manichees, that still they were friends. And when they differed, it was as a man might differ with himself without spite. So that's spirit. Is there any argument in Locke for tolerance on those grounds as something actually that is good for you, because you get to see all these different interesting ideas?
I think there are elements of the kind, yes. I mean, Augustine didn't say that about Donatists. There too, undoubtedly. Augustine did play a large causal role in sort of giving shape to the program of Christian persecution. Locke thought, he thought one thing, I think, be indisputable. He thought that diversity of opinion, broad diversity of opinion, was a certainty. It would always be a feature of the world. And he thought that the way in which humans should relate to one another, you must take due account of that, must give it the weight, the practical weight it evidently has. So, although he was, I think, even worse than me on the grounds of, as it were, his spontaneous capacity to respect the content of other people's beliefs, he did think that you should behave, he thought you should behave towards other people in a way which didn't express contempt because he thought their beliefs were rubbish. Also there is quite a lot in the essay which goes in the sort of direction that you were suggesting. There's a lot of stuff about the way in which belief is organized and its sort of inevitable individuation, which meant that the idea of trying to corral it was completely misguided. The task of trying to sort of get any legible and sort of iterative and reliable shape to it was what sort of philosophy, loosely speaking, was for. So it wasn't that he wasn't in favour of a project, an intense and actually very collective project of clarification, which goes very much in the direction of what you were saying, I think. It wasn't. You can read the essay as a sort of program of learning to look at other people's beliefs in what you might spontaneously think of as a more tolerant way, without having to tolerate the absurd conclusions in which they eventuated, or necessarily the fatuous premises from which they started out. He thought of human belief as a very, very exposed predicament, which extended across the species in question. So he thought that it would be good to try and get it into a somewhat sort of shapely condition and try and get the communication across it more accurate, more conspicuous. But he didn't think that we were going to achieve a very high level of success in that.
I have a question in terms of using Locke's letter today. I'm trying to understand what the political ethos of toleration would be based on. So for instance, you talk about what deserves or demands tolerance is what tells civil interests. Also, in a certain way, radically and fundamentalist religious groups, they would see certain civil interests as organized very much like a religion, like it's seeing it as against, and we saw that at the budget debates, at the White House. How do we, so that was one part of my question, is how can we sort of try to understand also that this framing of a political state based on an ethos of tolerance to other groups of people also look as if it's a system of religious belief, right? And then my second question would be this kind of establishment of political ethos as a unity of state. How do we take that into let's say an age in which we're constantly becoming more globalized and industrial and more connected? In a certain way, it reminds me sort of Augustine's project, because he did use state coercion to expand the church and to open it up and actually to break down certain kinds of church hierarchies around laymen, policies around laymen. So in a way, he was also, in his state coerced kind of way, he was also advocating more tolerance in a specific kind of manner. So I'm just wondering how we would try to interpret his ethos of the tolerance that he thought of.
So, those are very challenging questions, but they're very, very interesting. I think the civil interest one is particularly important. And I'd say one thing rather sort of buoyantly about it, which is that I think it's clear from the way in which Locke thought about it, that the idea of civil interests being reconciliatory, space of potential reconciliation in democratic deliberation was hopeless. And I mean, the way Locke was thinking about politics as a problem wasn't a way which had much in common causally with the articulation of political conflict in a society like the United States. And I think you can tell, as I open the newspaper, that this is a pretty violently unreconciliatory space. And I don't think an ethos of tolerance, I mean, I'm afraid the way I see it, I mean, an ethos of tolerance and the pragmatic character of that interaction are very violently inimical to one another. And it isn't the ethos of tolerance which is winning, it's the other. And I expect that to go on. I think there's a very strong sort of causal structure going on in that process, and the ethos of tolerance is a much sort of vaguer and less peremptory sort of thing. And it's beyond its reach when it's trying to discipline that and make it more seemingly kinder and more generous and more imaginative about other people who will gain, who you will have to lose in order to assist again. I mean, I don't see that at all myself. But I think the really sort of harsh one of the two questions, I think, is the one about an appropriate political ethos to be articulated by a political community as a political structure under conditions of globalization. I think that is a question which is completely unsolved in any state of the world today. I think it's a question which has come up over the horizon very, very fast, and the imaginative resources on which we spontaneously draw aren't really at all, it's not just that they aren't sufficient for it, but many of them aren't really appropriate for it, because they're not focused on it, they're focused on experiences some way back. And I think we have to see that this is a new sort of challenge. And what I was trying to do, the point of what I was saying, I thought, was to say, look, we must recognize that even the most sort of inspiring and intellectually impressive bits of our fairly distant past aren't really aimed at where we are now. And we must face up to where we are now.
Well, I guess just in defense of an ethos, it's true that part of the tenor of Locke's description of an ethos has a kind of civility to it and niceness to it, which is pretty foreign from the texture of our public debates in the fights that we have. And so kind of just being nice to one another isn't really, isn't what I was getting at. The sense of just, that we should be nice to each other is going to solve the problems of when, you have these factions that want to throttle one another and preclude them from being able to pursue their own civil interests. I think that, nevertheless, when people are calling for tolerance, say when David Cameron is saying that we don't need this passive tolerance, we need muscular liberalism, what's the difference between those two things? Is he saying that we have to go in there and shove individual rights down the throats of groups who it's foreign to their ideals to have that? And so
I think that's what he is saying.
Yes, and I think that that's probably not really the best way to try to go about managing the differences that exist in England, right now, in trying to do with that. So I agree that Locke is not giving us the solution to this question, but I don't want to interpret an ethos of tolerance as simply, everyone's being nice and pussyfooting around each other, or we are imposing dogmatic individual rights, and that is the only interpretation of toleration that can do the trick. There has to be some way of thinking about, well, how do we actually, how does the ruler, how does the sovereign, how does whoever it is, David Cameron, go about trying to set, you know, a tone in which human beings can communicate with one another instead of simply decimating each other. I think that there's space for a new way to think about an ethos of tolerance. Yeah.